forward to my computer here, share my screen. So this is actually, a lot of this is going to be in chapter 14, and some of it is from stuff that once again we skipped over, unfortunately, and I'm trying to fill in some blanks or gaps, okay? So really I'm trying to still at least mention those things, I guess, even though we kind of skipped over reading the chapters, okay? All right, so this is called, notice what it says here, and this may be a little bit confusing for you because it says renewing the sectional struggle, right? And we were kind of just talking about the sectional struggle with the results of the Mexican-American War. One of the reasons why it says renewing the sectional struggle is you're also going to hear me refer back to this lecture to the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which we kind of skipped over once again because we had to skip a few chapters, okay? But you'll kind of learn about that today. So, all right. Now, I do want to pose a key question here, something to think about as we're getting into the Civil War and finishing the course. Really, there's only like 3 weeks left of the course, not counting Christmas break, right? What are the irreconcilable differences that will eventually lead to civil war? Now, of course, I've tried to present the case to you that slavery and its extension is the primary cause of the Civil War, but there may be some other things that are coming up too that we want to watch out for, because this is going to be the most tragic war in American history, right? We're going to lose 620,000 people. The second worst is World War II, where we lose 400,000. So we lose a lot of people. I mean, we're killing each other. We couldn't work this stuff out when we're killing each other, which is, sad. So we want to keep this question in mind as we go forward. What irreconcilable differences will eventually lead to civil war? Okay? All right, so let me start with this. So on Tuesday, I told you about the Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, and there are some controversies as a result of that war and a treaty that was very favorable to us, okay? So what are those controversies? One is, would slavery expand into newly acquired land? Now think about the years here. The Mexican War is going to take place, the Mexican-American War, from 1846 to 1848. We're going to acquire a lot of new territory. There's going to be some questions as to what to do with that territory. Once again, which states should be slave or free? Texas wants to be bigger than it is now. Texas was claiming parts in New Mexico and other regions. It had also developed a large national debt. When Texas was independent, after the war for Texan independence, they had developed a large national debt. And there was a question, okay, who's going to handle that debt? California will apply for statehood. This is a consequence of gold, right? The gold rush had occurred, right? 1849, San Francisco 49ers, right? So if you look here, the key questions are dealing with Texas and California, and now California is applying for statehood. They've grown in population, and a lot of that is due to the gold rush, rapid population growth. Okay, and once again, you also have this region called the unorganized territory. That's going to be a factor here. What's going to happen with those? How many of those are going to be turned into states? And once again, which states are going to be slave? Which states are going to be free? Is California a free state? Is Texas a slave state, right? Well, Texas kind of already actually is. So do you make, what does California want to be, right? So a lot of questions. And then another issue that comes up, notice these are controversies after the Mexican-American War. The other issue is, what about slavery in Washington, D.C.? There's a growing movement, and maybe you're reading about this in your Garrison article or the chapter we dealt with on, yesterday. Some felt slavery in Washington, D.C. is very embarrassing to the nation. And so abolitionists are advocating that slavery should not be in Washington, D.C., which is interesting because Washington, D.C. is actually located in the South, or at least the upper South, right? Some people thought of this as an embarrassment. I'm quoting Dr. David Blight here, but I'm quoting one of his lectures, but he said there were times you could like smell the odor from the slave pens, right, at the Capitol building. And, you're inviting world leaders in, and this is what they're seeing from the supposed great democracy, right? So abolitionists are arguing like there should not be slavery in DC, okay? So that's another issue that comes up. I want to go back to the map that I left you with from the last lecture. And just to kind of show you a little bit. So this is Texas, right? This is Texas coming out of the Mexican-American War, and Texas wants to be bigger than it is now, right? They want to be this part of New Mexico and then up into here. And right? And you can see this map also gives us the borders of states as they exist now, right? That Texas is not going to stay with this long strip of land here, right? Kind of an awkward strip of land there, I suppose. Okay. You also know, I want you to think about some things that you've read in the past. Like you have read about Southern officials coveting land in South America or the Caribbean, Nicaragua, for example. You've read about filibustering, right? There's discussions going on already in this time period about the possibility of a canal. Panama has come up. There's been a transcontinental railroad built across Colombia. And all that factors in and relates to the United States going from ocean to ocean, because you're talking about the best way to ship goods and things like that, right? And so we also start to see discussions of the United States building a transcontinental railroad. So all these things that I'm listing and maybe rambling on about, these are all discussions and maybe controversies and issues coming out of the Mexican-American War, okay? The key issue is, of course, what to do with all this acquired territory, okay, from the Mexican Cession of 1848, as it's called here. There's going to be some solutions proposed. And if you probably haven't read any of this yet, guys, some of this will be in chapter 14, which is why I'm encouraging you to read that. Just consider my lecture an introduction here, okay? So what are the different solutions? Well, you have a formation of a group called Free Soilers, okay? And they're actually going to form a free soil party. And what they support is, and what they want is, all new territory should be free, right? All new territory should be free. We can't do anything about where slavery already exists. The Constitution says we can't do that, but all new territory should be free. Now, the Free Soil Party is an interesting group. They're made up of those who oppose slavery on moral grounds, people like Garrison, who like slavery is evil, shouldn't exist, period, okay, to those who don't want to share land with African Americans. So you've got free soilers who are moral people, good people, who think slavery is bad, believe African Americans should be treated equally, right? And then you have other who are, quite frankly, racist, who maybe believe in segregation. They want to be able to move to these territories and not associate with Black people, okay, slave or otherwise. And then you have those who hate slavery because it makes wage labor less attractive, okay? These are going to be called, and it gets a little bit confusing, these are going to be called, this is going to be called the free labor ideology. So these are people, and what they mean by free labor, they mean you and I controlling our labor, right? So the free labor ideology means, what does a man or a woman possess about themselves? They possess their work ethic, they possess their talents, they possess their skills, and they should be able to be hired for those, right? They shouldn't be enslaved. They should be able to control their labor. It's a free labor ideology. If you believe in the free labor ideology, then you want these new territories to be free. So people who can go there can get paid wages for their labor. You don't want this land being gobbled up by slave owners, because then you're reducing the possibility of people to be paid for their labor, okay? As a matter of fact, they believe that if you spread slavery to these territories, it makes wage labor less attractive and destroys the possibility of a working class or common man owning property. These people believe that slavery destroys the American dream, right? Pretty good argument, right? So that's your free soilers. You've got those who are abolitionists, those who are segregationists, and those who just believe that a man, probably a man in this time period, but hopefully some believe women too, should get paid for their labor, okay? And those new territories should be free soil. And there was a proposal to advocate this, and that was the Wilmot Proviso. This is proposed by Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot, and the proposal is to prohibit slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. It'll be defeated in 1846, but would have been supported, of course, by followers of free soil, okay? So we're starting to see some, arguments against essentially the Southern way of life occurring. And you notice the location. This guy's from Pennsylvania, right? Think about Pennsylvania and abolitionist history going all the way back to the Quakers, right? Okay. All right, other proposals that were occurring. So once again, these are proposals to deal with the territory acquired in the Mexican-American War. One is popular sovereignty. And this is going to be adopted by an up-and-coming congressman by the name of Stephen A. Douglas, okay? Popular sovereignty is, the idea behind this is allow people who live in new territories to vote and decide themselves, which on the surface seems very reasonable, right? Let people go to these territories, settle them, and self-determine, right? Determine whether or not they want slavery, determine whether or not they want free territory, right? Seems reasonable. Seems to be a nice compromise between free soilers and those who want self-determination. There is one fatal defect, though, and that is that the possibility of extending the blight of slavery to those who are dramatically opposed to it. And it's also going to be controversially carried out, which we'll get to later. There's going to be some problems with popular sovereignty. There's going to be conflict that breaks out. There's going to be essentially a civil war in Kansas as a result of this before the Civil War actually starts, right? Known as Bleeding Kansas, okay? So how it's carried out is going to be problematic. And then the third idea, and this will help fill in some gaps of things that we had to, move past, is extend the Missouri Compromise line, okay? And I'll explain that in a moment. Okay, so we're going to go back in the past for a moment and talk about the Missouri Compromise. I mean, we're always in the past, but we're going to go back to, we're going to go back from where we're at. So this map deals with the Missouri Compromise line. Okay, here's the Missouri Compromise line. The issue is, or the issue was, in 1820, Missouri, the state here, right, applied for statehood. Okay, and the people applying there were slaves in Missouri, and they wanted to be a slave state, right? And every time a state came into the Union, there was concern about representation in Congress. What we're seeing throughout this time period is a balance. We're having equal northern free states to equal southern slave states. So there's a balance in representation, at least to some degree. So when Missouri comes in, there is a compromise passed. The compromise is, okay, Missouri can be admitted as a slave state, but from here on out, any expansion that occurs, if it's north of this line, it's a free state. If it's south of this line, it's a slave state. Okay. Now, there's a big problem here, right? Once Mexican-American War is won, this is California. California is our, well, not our biggest state land-wise, that's Alaska, well, Texas too probably, but California is a very long state, right? The Missouri Compromise line is splitting California in half. California as a state doesn't want to be split in half. So what do you do with California? You can't make it half slave and half free. And actually, the people of California don't want to be a slave state. Okay. So the compromise of Missouri, the Missouri Compromise in 1820, isn't addressing the issue of the new territories. Okay. So now we need another compromise. Okay. So who could develop a compromise is the question on my next slide. Now, I think it's important to note that the U.S. political system has been based on compromise ever since the Constitutional Convention, right? Think the Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is a little more dubious, of course. But our nation has been based on compromise. And maybe that's one thing that's frustrating about our current time period is we seem to be so extreme right now. There's not a lot of compromising going on. But historically speaking, it's been a nation of compromises, right? And so here we are coming out of the Mexican Cession, late 1840s, going into 1850. We've got all this new territory. We have to determine what territory is going to be slave, okay, what's going to be free. We need another compromise. We did this in 1820. We got to do it again in 1850 to address the issue. Now, the president is going to be Zachary Taylor, who's a hero of the Mexican-American War, right? Taylor will be elected in 1848. He's going to serve from 1849 to 1850. He's another president who's going to die in office. But now let's look at Taylor's war record here, a little bit of background. He had served in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, and the Mexican-American War. And his leadership in that war is what probably propelled him into the presidency. He's going to die of natural causes 16 months into his presidency. Now, he never really took a stance on the issue of extension of slavery. He was just kind of whatever happens, happens. But he was a slaveholder from Louisiana, okay? But he's also a Whig, right? Something I need to wear, right? A Whig. I'll tell you about the Whigs in a moment. We are into our second American party system, okay? Remember, our first was Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which kind of morphed into Democratic Republicans, right? We're into our second American party system, Whigs and Democrats. And I'll give you a little bit of the history behind that here in a moment, okay? So Taylor's a Whig, and the Whigs tend to be opposed to the extension of slavery, but he's also a slaveholder from Louisiana, which is maybe why he was just kind of neutral on this issue while he was in office. Now he passes away, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, replaces him, okay? The key issue, the key people who lead on this compromise, though, aren't necessarily the presidents, it's the people of Congress, okay? And one of those is Henry Clay, who I mentioned the other day. Now, Henry Clay is considered by many to be the most significant congressman in history. He was a member of the House of Representatives and then a senator from Kentucky. I hope this picture doesn't scare you here. He kind of looks like Skeletor in this image. He's getting older here, right? He's about 73 in 1850, but he was key in negotiating the Missouri Compromise, right? And he takes leadership on this, but really the guy behind the scenes who is making a lot of things happen is a new up-and-coming congressman by the name of Stephen Douglas, okay? And notice he spells his last name different from Frederick. He only has one S on the end of it. But he's a senator from Illinois. And what we see happening here, he's young. What we see happening here is you've got the old legends of Congress, so to speak, kind of combining with the new up and coming, the up and coming stars, right? And what do I mean by old legends? Clay does a lot of speaking on this issue. Douglas kind of works more behind the scenes. You've also got Daniel Webster, who will speak in support of the Compromise of 1850, who I'm going to get to in a moment. A longtime congressman, often considered the best orator in American history. But to quote Dr. Blight again, those are people who hadn't seen Frederick Douglass speak yet, okay? And then you also have John C. Calhoun, who will actually give a speech in this time period for the South, for slavery. He's a states' rights guy. He's dying. Like he'll give his last speech about concerning issues revolving around these territories. He's actually dying of tuberculosis so you've got some old stalwarts, right, who have been in Congress for a while, who are taking leadership on this issue, but then you've got some young guys, right, who are really working behind the scenes to make things happen. And what you end up with is the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so Compromise of 1850. California is going to enter the Union as a free state. Now remember that violates the Missouri Compromise line. And just to repeat, and I don't know that I gave you the degrees there, but according to the Missouri Compromise, slavery could not exist north of 3630. Okay, it could exist south of that, right? California is going to be free, right? Even though just about half of it is below 3630. Okay, so Compromise of 1850, California enters the Union as a free state. Slavery in Utah and New Mexico territories, they're going to be these are going to be carved out of the newly organized territories. They're going to be carved out of that unorganized territory, which maybe you noticed on a previous map. So Utah and New Mexico territories are going to be decided by popular sovereignty. The Texas border will be settled. It's not going to get that part of New Mexico that it wanted. That up northern part, the length of the territory there is going to be denied. It's going to be settled, and its debt will be paid. That additional territory that'll be carved out of Texas will become part of the U.S. Become part of these other states, right? And New Mexico in particular. Texas finally drops its demands for additional territory and becomes officially part of the United States. It is no longer known as the Lone Star Republic. Probably some of that was the willingness of the United States to pay its debts. Slave trade in Washington. There's a compromise in D.C. The slave trade will be outlawed, so you won't have those slave pens and slave auctions in our nation's capital anymore. But slavery will still remain. So you can have slaves in D.C., but you can't have slave trade going on in D.C. Okay. The other part of the compromise, 1850, and maybe the part that's going to be the most, it's going to cause the most conflict going forward, is strict enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Now, there's been a fugitive slave law in our Constitution really since its inception. This is going to be a stricter version of that law. And according to the Compromise of 1850, it will be strictly enforced. Got about 6 minutes or so here, kids. I may not get through all this today, but that's my plan is to probably finish it up on Tuesday of next week. Okay. Hopefully you're getting all that down. I'm trying to pause a little bit for those who were writing these down. Okay, so here's a good map dealing with the Compromise of 1850 because it shows what happens. You see what happens to, right? The territory that Texas was claiming, they lose that. We get our borders for Texas as they exist currently. We see the New Mexico territory and the Utah territories being carved out. We still have some unorganized territory up here yet, right? Just check, make sure. Now, what do the colors mean on this map? The northern regions in blue is where slavery is forbidden, or at least supposed to be. In nations shown in, I guess this is reddish orange, this is where slavery is legal, right? These regions here, right? And in territories in yellow or orange is yellow here, right? This is where slavery will be determined by popular sovereignty, which there's going to be some problematic issues with that. So essentially what the Compromise of 1850 has done is it's repealed the Missouri Compromise. We now see the possibility of slavery existing north of 3630, at least in the Utah territory. Okay. So let's look at the significance of this compromise. Significance: the nation avoided war for 10 years. Okay. 11. And this is significant because over the next 10 years, northern states are going to grow in population and they're going to grow in industrial might, industrial power as compared to the South. And if you think about it, that's very key for the North winning the war. A very key factor, maybe the key factor is northern industrial might in winning the Civil War. Once the South seceded and the North said they weren't going to let them secede, really the South was somewhat in trouble from the beginning because of the industrial capacity with the North. The South does have some advantages though, but we'll talk about that when we actually get to the fighting. There will also be a series of crises that will still occur across these 10 years. The Compromise of 1850 really doesn't resolve the disagreement. It doesn't dissolve the tension. It doesn't dissolve the crises that occur. Okay? There's not like peace and everybody getting along, which you hope would happen after a compromise. For example, people get really concerned about the issue of popular sovereignty, right? They get concerned that this could lead to slavery spreading throughout the country, possibly. If you're an abolitionist, that's a concern. The biggest issue, however, and let me just close with this today, I've got a couple minutes, is the new fugitive slave law. This is going to be part of the Compromise of 1850. So, all runaway slaves, so the fugitive slave law, what are the conditions? All runaway slaves had to be returned to their owners. And why are people upset? Because it became illegal to aid runaway slaves. Citizens were actually required to assist in the recovery of runaway slaves. So think if you're a person living in the North who doesn't like slavery, right? Think about how offended you might be by this. Whites opposed to slavery could face jail time or fines, like whites who assisted, right? Or whites who made anti-slavery arguments, things like that. Accused runaways, notice accused runaways. So sometimes maybe they weren't, maybe they were freed blacks, were denied a jury trial. A judge decided their fate. That upset a lot of people. They felt like this should be a jury issue. You're talking about a person's freedom. And listen to this. Magistrates, judges, right? They received $10 ruling in favor of an owner, $5 for ruling in favor of the slave. So you made more money as a judge if you sided with the owner. Now, maybe the reason for this was the owner typically had more money, but there's going to be a lot of judges, particularly if they have some prejudice in their hearts, which a lot of Americans did in this time period, and unfortunately many do now. You can imagine, I'll take the $10. This guy's going back to slavery, right? So as a consequence of this, what was happening is many legally free slaves were finding themselves back in slavery, and some were being kidnapped back into slavery. Once again, let me remind you of Solomon Northup, who this happened to, although his kidnapping happened before 1850. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about when I continue this lecture, probably on Tuesday, is a reaction to this going forward. Okay. How people react to this, what they do, things like that. All right. As a key issue leading into that question, there are reconcilable differences involving the Civil War. Okay. Any questions or observations, kids? This is a good place to stop this right here. This is good. Don't forget about your questions about Garrison tomorrow. You know what I'm probably going to do with that, right? I'm probably going to put you in breakout rooms and have you present your answers so I can learn from you tomorrow. Okay? All right, guys. Have a good day. If you have questions about anything, let me know.